My parents skipped my wedding. They sent a text 12 hours before I walked down the aisle, calling the most important day of my life a trivial event, and explicitly told me not to bother them. A week later, my mother posted a video of herself sipping cocktails in Hawaii with my sister and her husband. When my father called me in a panic days later, complaining that his mortgage payment had bounced, I simply replied, "Do not contact me about trivial matters," before I reveal exactly how I legally dismantled their entire lives. Let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to teach toxic family members a lesson they will never forget. My name is Clara. I am 33 years old, and I work as a director of risk management at a major insurance corporation in Chicago. I have spent my entire professional career analyzing threats, calculating probabilities, and mitigating disasters before they can cause permanent damage. It is a highly analytical, cold, and data-driven profession. But nothing could have prepared me to apply those exact same corporate survival tactics to my own biological family. I stood outside the heavy oak doors of the historic chapel in downtown Chicago, smoothing the lace of my wedding dress. My fiancé, David, squeezed my hand. He looked incredibly handsome in his tailored suit, and his warm presence grounded me just as it always did. David owned a highly successful upscale boutique restaurant chain in Illinois. His steady, protective nature and genuine kindness were the perfect balance to my highly analytical mind. The traditional wedding march began to echo from inside the chapel. The coordinator gave us a bright smile and slowly pulled the heavy doors open. The afternoon sunlight poured into the room, illuminating the faces of our guests. My eyes immediately locked onto the front row on the left side. 4 mahogany chairs sat completely empty. They were front and center, perfectly positioned for the parents of the bride, my sister, and my brother-in-law. But there was no one sitting there. The void they left was loud and heavy. A few guests in the second row were already whispering, casting uncomfortable glances at the vacant seats. I did not cry. My heart did not break in that moment because the break had already happened exactly 12 hours earlier, the night before the wedding. I was sitting in my hotel suite finalizing the reception's seating chart when my phone buzzed with a message from my mother. Patricia. My mother was a woman who was obsessed with country club status and keeping up appearances. She cared more about how things looked to her wealthy friends than how things actually felt to her own children. The text message read, "We have a sudden critical business project that we cannot cancel. Your wedding is a trivial event anyway since no major investors will be there. Do not bother us." I had stared at the glowing screen for a long time. There was no apology. There was no explanation of this supposed business emergency. There was only a cold calculation of my worth. To my parents, a wedding was only valuable if it offered a networking opportunity. My father, Richard, was a fiercely arrogant man who always believed he was entitled to control everything around him, including his children and their finances. My younger sister, Brittany, was their undeniable golden child. She was 30 years old but acted like a spoiled teenager constantly bleeding money to maintain a fake affluent aesthetic as a lifestyle influencer on social media. Her husband Jamal was an African-American man who styled himself as a tech startup genius. In reality, Jamal was constantly pitching empty business ideas, burning through investor cash, and driving leased luxury cars he could barely afford. They all viewed my life and my choices as boring or unworthy of their time, because I valued stability and hard work over flashy displays of wealth. I was the cold daughter who worked with data and risk. David and I were self-made, and we did not invite venture capitalists or society elites to our wedding. We invited genuine friends and colleagues. To my mother. That meant my wedding was utterly useless to her social climbing agenda. Standing at the threshold of the chapel, I felt David gently rub his thumb over my knuckles. He knew about the text message. He had held me the night before while I processed the ultimate rejection from the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. He asked me with his eyes if I was okay. I took a deep breath and nodded. My risk management brain kicked into high gear. I was not going to let 4 empty chairs ruin the aesthetic of my wedding or the joy of my day. I was not going to let my guests pity me as I walked down the aisle toward a glaring reminder of my family abandoning me. I calmly turned to the wedding coordinator, who was standing nearby with a worried expression. I pointed to the front row. "Remove those 4 chairs." I said, my voice completely steady. "Take them out of the room right now." The coordinator blinked in surprise, but quickly nodded. She rushed down the side aisle and motioned for 2 ushers to help her. I watched with a profound sense of detachment as the men physically lifted the 4 expensive mahogany chairs and carried them away into a side room. The space where my toxic family was supposed to be was now completely erased. I did not stop there. I walked forward slightly and caught the attention of my 4 closest friends who were seated in the 3rd row. These were the women who had helped me pick out my dress. The ones who had listened to me vent about my stressful corporate job. The ones who had celebrated every milestone in my relationship with David. I smiled and motioned for them to move up to the front row. They understood immediately. They gathered their programs and purses and slid into the premier spot at the very front, filling the void with genuine warmth and excitement. They beamed at me, their eyes shining with happy tears of support. I turned back to David. He was looking at me with such profound respect and love that it took my breath away. He offered me his arm and I took it. The music swelled again and we began our walk down the aisle together. I did not look back at the doors, and I did not think about my parents, my sister, or my brother-in-law. I looked at the faces of the people who had actively chosen to be there. I saw my colleagues, my mentors, David, loyal restaurant staff, and our chosen family. The wedding ceremony was absolutely beautiful. The sunlight caught the stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns across the floor. We exchanged our vows with clear voices and full hearts. For the first time in my life, I experienced a major milestone that was completely devoid of toxic family tension. There was no mother criticizing the floral arrangements. There was no father complaining about the cost of the catering. There was no sister trying to make the event about herself, and no brother-in-law bragging loudly about his fake businesses during the reception. It was a perfect, flawless celebration of love. I danced the entire night surrounded by people who valued me for exactly who I was. I thought I had successfully closed the chapter on my family toxicity. I thought the worst they could do was ignore me. But I had no idea that their absence was just the beginning of a massive web of financial deception that would soon force me to completely destroy the very foundation of their lives. The reception ended just past midnight. David and I retreated to our bridal suite at the Drake Hotel, overlooking the glittering Chicago skyline. We were exhausted but radiant. David loosened his silk tie and poured us both a glass of leftover champagne from the reception. We sat on the plush velvet sofa, kicking off our shoes and reflecting on how flawlessly the day had unfolded. There were no regrets. There were no dark clouds hovering over my mind. We had officially started our lives together, surrounded by people who respected us. But my analytical mind rarely sleeps. As David went into the marble bathroom to shower, I picked up my phone from the nightstand. I had silenced it for the past 48 hours to ensure nothing interrupted my focus. Now I felt a familiar nagging curiosity. I wanted to see exactly what critical business project was so important that my entire biological family had skipped my wedding. My sister Brittany had blocked me on all social media platforms 2 years ago after a petty argument about her maxing out a credit card under my father's name. She hated that I knew exactly how financially irresponsible she was. However, as a director of risk management, I understood the value of gathering intelligence. I maintained an anonymous account specifically to monitor her public profile. I tapped the Instagram icon and typed in her handle. Her profile loaded instantly. Her story ring was glowing with a bright magenta circle indicating a massive influx of new posts. I tapped the icon, The first video began playing and the audio hit me like a physical blow. Hawaiian ukulele music blared through my phone speakers, mixed with the sound of crashing ocean waves. The camera panned across a breathtaking, pristine white sand beach. The location tag in the top corner proudly announced the Wea Beach Resort in Maui, a 5-star luxury property where rooms easily cost upwards of $1,000 a night. I watched the next story. It showed a massive private cabana overlooking the Pacific Ocean. Inside the cabana, my mother, Patricia, was lounging in a designer swimsuit holding a brightly colored tropical cocktail. My father, Richard, was beside her, laughing loudly while wearing expensive designer sunglasses. The camera swung around to show my sister Brittany holding her phone high to capture her perfect angles. Beside her stood her husband Jamal, wearing a flashy linen shirt and throwing a peace sign at the camera. Their children were splashing in an exclusive infinity pool just a few feet away. They were not sitting in a boardroom. They were not negotiating a high-stakes corporate merger. They were not saving Jamal failing technology startup from the brink of disaster. They were on a tropical island indulging in top-tier luxury. I continued tapping through the sequence of videos. There was a private catamaran tour. There was a lavish seafood dinner featuring fresh lobster and imported champagne. There were videos of Jamal boasting about living the dream while clinking a $30 Mai Tai against my father's glass. Every single post was curated to project an image of limitless wealth and perfect family unity. They looked completely unbothered. They looked like people who had not a single care in the world, much less a daughter who had just walked down the aisle without them. Then I reached the final post. It was a perfectly posed group photo of all 6 of them standing on the beach at sunset. They were all wearing coordinated white and beige linen outfits, smiling brightly for the camera. I lowered my eyes to the caption beneath the photo. The words burned themselves into my retinas. It read, "Best family vacation ever. Thank you, Mom and Dad, for funding this entire luxury getaway." I froze. The ambient noise of the hotel room, the distant hum of Chicago traffic, the sound of the shower running in the background. All of it faded away into total silence. I stared at the glowing screen, reading that sentence over and over again. Thank you, Mom and Dad, for funding this entire luxury getaway. My hands did not shake. My eyes did not fill with tears. Instead, a cold, calculated, hyper-focus washed over me. The emotional side of my brain shut down completely, and the risk manager took the wheel. I began doing the financial math in my head. I factored in round-trip first-class flights from Chicago to Maui for 4 adults and 2 children. I calculated the cost of 2 adjoining oceanfront suites at a premier WIA resort for 7 nights. I estimated the daily expenditure for private cabana rentals, luxury dining, catamaran excursions, and top-shelf alcohol. The conservative estimate for a vacation of this magnitude was easily north of $40,000. My parents did not have $40,000 in disposable income. I knew their financial portfolio better than they did. I knew exactly how deep in debt they were. I knew that Richard's business ventures had stagnated and that Patricia's country club lifestyle was largely funded by credit cards hovering near their limits. But they had found the money. They had funded a lavish tropical getaway for their golden child and her grifter husband. The realization clicked into place with the terrifying precision of a vault door locking shut. I knew exactly where that $40,000 had come from. I knew exactly whose money they had used to pay for those Mai Tais, those oceanfront suites, and those first-class plane tickets. They were using my money. They were taking the thousands of dollars I had been saving them every single month and blowing it on a vacation designed to rub their non-existent wealth in everyone's faces. They had skipped my wedding, not because they were busy, but because they were busy spending my capital to celebrate the sister who despised me. David stepped out of the bathroom, toweling off his hair. He caught sight of my face and stopped dead in his tracks. The soft smile vanished from his lips, instantly replaced by fierce concern. He knew that look. It was the look I got when I uncovered a massive corporate fraud at work. "What is it?" he asked, stepping quickly toward the sofa. "What happened?" I slowly turned the phone around so the screen faced him. I let him read the caption. I let him see the pristine Hawaiian beach, the $30 cocktails, and the smiling faces of the people who had claimed they were dealing with a critical business emergency. David read the words, and his jaw clenched so hard a muscle twitched in his cheek. A low, angry breath escaped his lips. I looked up at my husband, my voice dropping to a terrifying calm whisper. "I am going to ruin them." My parents were sleeping in an expensive oceanfront cabana, completely unaware that they no longer had a home to return to. I closed my laptop and set it gently on the nightstand next to the hotel alarm clock. I turned off the bedside lamp and lay back against the crisp white pillows. Beside me, David shifted in his sleep and draped his heavy, warm arm across my waist. His breathing soon leveled out into a deep, rhythmic cadence. He was exhausted from the emotions of our wedding day. I was physically tired, but my mind was operating at maximum capacity. The adrenaline of executing a flawless risk management strategy kept me wide awake in the dark. I stared up at the shadows playing across the ceiling of our bridal suite and allowed my thoughts to drift back exactly 3 years. I needed to revisit the genesis of this entire financial arrangement to ensure I had not left a single legal loophole for my family to exploit. 3 years ago. The atmosphere in my parents' sprawling suburban Chicago home was nothing short of apocalyptic. I remembered walking into their massive marble kitchen and seeing stacks of final notice bills scattered across the granite countertops. Patricia was weeping theatrically into a silk handkerchief while Richard paced the hardwood floors like a caged animal. The crisis had not been caused by a medical emergency or a sudden economic downturn. It was entirely self-inflicted. It was the direct result of Jamal and his endless stream of fraudulent business ventures. At that time, Jamal had launched a flashy cryptocurrency startup that completely imploded. He had aggressively solicited investments from high net worth individuals, promising absurd returns. When the company inevitably collapsed due to his gross mismanagement and outright embezzlement, several early investors filed a massive class action lawsuit against him. Jamal had already drained every cent from Brittany to fund his luxury car leases and designer wardrobe, facing potential criminal charges and severe civil penalties. He went crying to my parents, Richard and Patricia, driven by their blinding favoritism for Brittany and their desperate need to maintain the illusion of a perfect family. Did the unthinkable. They took out a massive second mortgage on their sprawling estate. They liquidated their retirement accounts. They poured hundreds of thousands of dollars into Jamal, failing legal defense and settlement payouts. They bailed out the golden child husband, and in doing so, they completely bankrupted themselves. 6 months later, the bank initiated foreclosure proceedings on their home. That was when they called me. They summoned me to their house, not to apologize for their reckless behavior, but to demand that I fix their catastrophic mistakes. Richard stood in that kitchen and looked at me with absolute arrogance. He told me that since I had a highly lucrative corporate job and since I was the cold money-obs-obsessed daughter who never spent anything on fun or family, I was obligated to write them a check. They wanted me to simply hand over $300,000 to clear their debts. There was no business plan. There was no repayment schedule. They just wanted my capital to erase the consequences of their financial stupidity. I refused to hand them a blank check. I knew that giving cash to financially illiterate narcissists was the equivalent of setting it on fire. The ensuing argument was explosive. Patricia accused me of being a heartless monster who wanted to see her own parents thrown out onto the street. Richard called me selfish and ungrateful. I let them scream. I let them hurl their insults. Then I left their house and went straight to my corporate real estate attorney. I told him I wanted to save their home, but I refused to let them know I was the one doing it. I instructed my attorney to establish a blind limited liability company through this highly secure and completely anonymous LLC. I approached their bank and purchased their distressed mortgage note directly. It was a complex and aggressive financial maneuver, but it worked flawlessly, legally. My LLC became the sole owner of their debt. I became their bank. My parents were completely oblivious to my involvement. They received official notification that a private investment firm had acquired their mortgage and was willing to offer them a unique hardship modification program to prevent immediate foreclosure. I set up the new terms with surgical precision. I heavily subsidized their monthly payments, instead of the crushing $5,000 mortgage they previously owed. My LLC charged them a flat rate of $1,500 a month. That amount was carefully calculated to cover only the bare minimum: the annual property taxes and basic structural maintenance. It was a lifeline. It was a financial grace period designed to let them catch their breath and rebuild their savings. I set it up on an automatic payment system so they never had to interact with the supposed investment firm. I silently absorbed the financial spread, losing thousands of dollars of my own potential investment capital every single month just to keep a roof over their heads. I did all of this while they continued to treat me like a disappointment. I did all of this while they mocked my sensible car, my quiet lifestyle, and my dedication to my career. I did all of this while they praised Jamal as a misunderstood genius and celebrated Brittany as the ideal daughter, lying in the hotel bed. I mentally ran through the math one more time. Over the past 36 months, I had saved them exactly $126,000 in mortgage payments. I had given them the financial breathing room to recover from their self-inflicted disaster. And what did they do with that massive windfall of savings? They did not rebuild their retirement accounts. They did not pay off their remaining credit card debt. They took the thousands of dollars I quietly saved them every month, and they hoarded it. They stockpiled my financial mercy and used it to purchase first-class plane tickets to Hawaii. They used it to rent oceanfront cabanas and buy top-shelf liquor. They used my money to fund a lavish tropical vacation for Brittany and Jamal, while explicitly telling me that my wedding day was a trivial event not worth their time. The sheer audacity of their betrayal was staggering. They had taken my silent sacrifice and weaponized it to fund their own narcissism. They had skipped the most important day of my life to celebrate the very people who had nearly rendered them homeless. I looked at the digital clock on the nightstand. It was 4 a.m. The dark sky outside the window was just beginning to show the faintest hint of deep blue. Monday morning was approaching rapidly. My demand letter was already queued in my outbox, waiting for the start of the business day. The trap I had laid 3 years ago was perfectly constructed, and they had walked right into it with their eyes wide open and a cocktail in their hands. I took a deep, steadying breath and finally let myself relax into the mattress. I closed my eyes, feeling a profound sense of peace wash over me. The time for silent sacrifices was officially over. In a few short hours, the sun would rise over Chicago, and I would walk into my corporate office to begin the systematic and completely legal destruction of their entire world. David stared at the phone screen in my hand. The warmth and joy that had filled our bridal suite just moments ago vanished entirely. His jaw tightened, and a dark protective anger radiated from his posture. He grabbed his own phone from the nightstand, his fingers moving aggressively across the glass screen. He told me he was going to call Richard right now. He wanted to scream at my father for treating me like an afterthought. He wanted to demand answers for how they could justify sipping champagne on a tropical island while I walked down the aisle without them. I reached out and placed my hand firmly over his. I looked into his eyes and told him to stop. I explained that calling them was exactly the wrong move. If we called them right now in the heat of our anger, we would hand them exactly what they wanted. Emotional confrontations with narcissistic people never lead to accountability. Emotional confrontations only yield massive amounts of gaslighting. If David yelled at Richard, My father would simply twist the narrative. He would claim that the Hawaii trip was a crucial business networking opportunity for Jamal, and that the family had simply tagged along for moral support. He would accuse me of being a jealous bride who could not be happy for her own sister. My mother would chime in, crying fake tears about how stressful their lives were and how they desperately needed a vacation. They would turn themselves into the victims and paint me as the villain. I refused to play their toxic game. I stepped away from David and walked over to my leather travel bag resting on the luggage rack. I told my husband that emotions are messy and easily manipulated, but financial confrontations yield absolute, undeniable results. Numbers do not lie. Legal contracts do not care about hurt feelings or family dynamics. I pulled my laptop from the bag and set it up on the mahogany desk near the window. The glittering lights of downtown Chicago spread out beneath us, a stark contrast to the dark storm brewing in my mind. I opened the browser and navigated to a highly secure financial portal. This portal belonged to a blind, limited liability company I had established exactly 3 years ago, at that time. My parents were facing total financial ruin. Jamal had drained their savings with another one of his flashy but hollow tech startup ideas. They were weeks away from losing their sprawling suburban house to foreclosure. They had come to me crying, begging for a bailout. They assumed I would simply write them a massive check because I was the responsible daughter who always fixed their messes. Instead, I used my analytical skills. Through my anonymous LLC, I purchased their mortgage note directly from the bank. I essentially became their legal lender. I set up a heavily subsidized payment plan for them. They were paying my company a mere $1,500 a month. That fraction of a payment barely covered the annual property taxes and basic maintenance costs. I saved them thousands of dollars every single month to keep a roof over their heads. And what did they do with that financial mercy? They used the massive savings I provided to fund a luxury Hawaiian vacation for the sister who despised me. I logged into the portal and pulled up the original promissory note and the deed of trust. I clicked through the encrypted digital pages until I found the specific addendums I had drafted back then. I read the clauses out loud to David so he could fully grasp the magnitude of my leverage. I had built incredibly strict conditions into this lending contract. I included a rigid good faith financial hardship clause. The document explicitly stated that the heavily discounted monthly payment remained active only as long as the borrowers were experiencing genuine financial distress. The contract clearly mandated that if the borrowers demonstrated the capital for luxury travel or unnecessary lavish expenditures, the hardship discount would be immediately and permanently revoked. Richard had signed this contract 3 years ago without reading a single word of it. He signed it blindly because he was arrogant. He assumed he could always manipulate his daughter. He thought I was just handing over a financial lifeline out of blind familial duty. He never respected my career in corporate risk management enough to realize I would meticulously protect my own assets. He literally handed me the legal authority to destroy his housing security the moment he decided to take advantage of my charity. A cold sense of satisfaction settled into my chest. I opened a new document on my laptop and began drafting a formal legal notice. It was a termination of their hardship discount. I typed with absolute precision, choosing every word carefully to ensure maximum legal impact. I stated that due to clear photographic evidence of disposable income, the subsidized rate of $1,500 a month was permanently canceled. The contract would immediately revert to the standard market interest rate retroactive to the date of the breach. But I did not stop there. I scrolled down to the most potent weapon in the contract. I invoked the acceleration clause because my parents had flagrantly violated the terms of the good faith agreement. The entire principal balance of the loan was now due. I was calling in the debt, $300,000 payable in exactly 30 days, if they failed to produce the full amount. My LLC would initiate immediate foreclosure and eviction proceedings. I read the drafted notice one more time to ensure every legal requirement was perfectly met. David stood behind my chair, reading over my shoulder. He rested his hands on my shoulders and leaned down to kiss the top of my head. He knew exactly what this document meant. I saved the file and prepared an email to my corporate real estate attorney. I scheduled it to send first thing on Monday morning so my lawyer could formalize the demand letter and hire a process server. I closed my laptop and let out a long, slow breath. The silent trap was set. The domino effect was primed. My parents were sleeping in an expensive oceanfront cabana, completely unaware that they no longer had a home to return to. I stepped out of the elevator onto the 42nd floor of the corporate insurance firm in downtown Chicago. The heavy glass doors slid open with a soft hiss, welcoming me back to my sanctuary of data logic and absolute control. The weekend was officially over. I carried my coffee past the bustling rows of cubicles where junior analysts were already deep into their morning reports. I walked straight to my corner office and closed the heavy glass door behind me, shutting out the corporate noise. I set my briefcase down and powered up my dual monitors. The screens flared to life, reflecting the morning sun bouncing off the skyscrapers outside. I took a slow sip of my black coffee and let the sharp, bitter taste ground me. It was exactly 8 o'clock in the morning. My parents were likely still asleep in their lavish cabana in Hawaii, recovering from a night of expensive seafood and top-shelf liquor funded entirely by my capital. I opened a highly encrypted browser window and navigated to the secure banking portal for my blind limited liability company. I bypassed the standard login screen using a two-factor authentication hardware key that only I possessed. The dashboard loaded immediately, displaying the active portfolios and property deeds under my management. I clicked on the specific subfolder containing my parents' distressed mortgage note. The screen populated with their payment history. I stared at 36 months of perfect $1,500 automatic transfers. 36 months of me silently absorbing the massive financial blow so they could live comfortably in a house they technically lost years ago. I stared at those numbers feeling nothing but cold, calculated resolve. I navigated to the administrative control panel. The interface presented me with a series of drop-down menus and toggle switches regulating the strict terms of their loan. I found the section labeled Hardship Forbearance active. This was the specific legal mechanism that kept their interest rate artificially deflated. I hovered my cursor over the Edit button. With a single decisive click, I changed the status to Contract Breach Terminated. A red warning prompt appeared on the center of my screen asking me to confirm the cancellation of the active autopay mandate and the revocation of the forbearance agreement. I clicked Confirm without a second of hesitation. The system refreshed. The safety net was officially gone. The financial oxygen supply that had kept them breathing for 3 years was completely severed. Their bank account would no longer automatically push the $1,500 payment to my LLC on the first of the month. Instead, they would be marked as delinquent the moment the billing cycle ended. Next, I moved to the Interest Rate Adjustment tab. The heavily subsidized rate I had gifted them was immediately stripped away. I manually reinstated the standard market interest rate retroactively, applying the standard terms outlined in the original promissory note they had signed, because they had flagrantly violated the good faith clause by funding a luxury vacation. The system automatically calculated the penalty fees. 36 months of retroactive interest adjustments populated on the screen, adding a massive lump sum to their outstanding debt. The numbers multiplied rapidly, transforming their manageable, subsidized loan into a staggering financial liability that would bankrupt them all over again. I reviewed the final calculation on the screen. The leniency I had shown them was entirely wiped out, replaced by the ruthless reality of corporate lending. I opened my secure email client and addressed a new message to my corporate real estate attorney, Harrison. Harrison was a shark in a tailored suit, a man who specialized in aggressive asset recovery, hostile foreclosures, and corporate evictions. He did not ask personal questions or care about family dynamics. He simply executed orders with lethal precision. I attached the updated financial ledger, the original signed promissory note, and the high-defin screenshots of Britney Instagram stories clearly showing my parents funding a luxury vacation for the entire family. I kept my instructions brief and absolute. I directed Harrison to draft a formal demand for payment and issue a notice of intent to foreclose. I instructed him to invoke the acceleration clause immediately based on the documented breach of the hardship agreement. I typed the final demand clearly. $300,000 in accelerated principal plus all retroactive penalties and legal fees due in exactly 30 days. I explicitly added a note stating there would be no negotiations, no extensions, and no settlement offers accepted under any circumstances if the funds were not wired to the LLC escrow account by the end of the 30th day. He was to file the eviction paperwork with the county court and schedule the sheriff deputies to physically remove them from the property. I proofread the email once, ensuring the tone was entirely devoid of emotion. It was a flawless execution of risk management protocol. I hit send. The email vanished from my outbox, flying through the encrypted corporate servers directly to Harrison's desk. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair and looked out over the sprawling Chicago skyline. The machinery of their destruction was now fully automated and completely out of my hands. My parents had spent their entire lives treating people like disposable assets. They had prioritized superficial appearances over their own daughter. They had assumed their actions would never have consequences because they had always managed to manipulate their way out of trouble by relying on my sense of duty. But they had never dealt with a faceless corporate entity that held the legal deed to their home. I took another sip of my coffee, feeling a deep, satisfying calm settle into my bones. The trap had officially sprung. All I had to do now was wait for the dominoes to fall. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, my calendar alerted me to the weekly high-level corporate risk assessment committee meeting. I gathered my tablet and a fresh cup of coffee before walking down the corridor to the executive boardroom. This was a room designed for serious capital decisions, featuring floor-to-ceiling glass walls overlooking the Chicago River and a massive polished mahogany table equipped with integrated conference technology. As the director of risk management, my seat was permanently reserved near the head of the table alongside the chief financial officer and the director of procurement. Our agenda for the afternoon was heavily focused on reviewing and vetting a new list of third-party software vendors. The insurance firm was currently undergoing a massive digital infrastructure upgrade. We needed specialized software to integrate our legacy mainframes with modern cloud-based data sorting algorithms. Any vendor plugging into our system required rigorous vetting. That was my department. We were the absolute gatekeepers who ensured no external entity could compromise our proprietary data or expose the firm to massive financial liability. The director of procurement stood at the front of the room holding a laser pointer. He was a fast-talking executive who cared primarily about cutting costs and acquiring flashy new tech to impress the board of directors. He clicked his remote and the massive digital projection screen flared to life, displaying a sleek modern corporate logo. I glanced down at my digital dossier. We were moving into the preliminary approval phase for our secondary data sorting contract. The procurement director began his presentation enthusiastically, praising this new agile startup that had somehow managed to bypass the usual months-long bureaucratic vetting process by networking directly with one of our senior vice presidents at an exclusive charity golf tournament. I looked up at the projection screen. The logo featured a stylized, geometric mountain peak above a bold, sans-serif font. I read the name out loud in my head. Apex Nexus Solutions. My breath caught in my throat for a fraction of a second. I forced my facial muscles to remain completely neutral. I stared at the name on the screen, ensuring my eyes were not playing tricks on me. I knew that ridiculous buzzword-heavy name. I knew the amateurish graphic design of the logo. Apex Nexus Solutions was Jamal Newest's technology startup. It was the exact same company he had been bragging about on his social media accounts for the past 6 months while driving his least luxury cars. I sat perfectly still, listening to the executive outline the operational capabilities of a company I knew for a fact was currently being run out of my sister's spare bedroom. He spoke confidently about their innovative algorithmic sorting processes and their dynamic approach to cloud integration. He read directly from Jamal's marketing brochure, reciting empty corporate jargon that sounded highly impressive to older executives who did not understand the actual coding infrastructure. I knew Jamal had zero background in software engineering. He was a hype man. He sold vaporware to wealthy investors, relying on his charismatic pitches to secure funding before inevitably burning through the capital and declaring bankruptcy. And now he had managed to talk his way into the highest level of a multi-billion-dollar insurance corporation. The presentation clicked to the next slide outlining the financial terms of the proposed agreement. The corporate procurement team had fast-tracked the negotiation phase. They announced with a proud smile that they were prepared to formally approve a preliminary contract for $500,000. The funds were scheduled to be released as a massive upfront payment to facilitate the immediate integration of the Apex Nexus software with our internal mainframe. $500,000. The sheer scale of the grift was breathtaking. I looked around the executive boardroom, watching the other directors nod in agreement. They were ready to hand $500,000 of corporate funds over to my sister husband, based on a slick presentation and a few rounds of golf. In that exact moment, every single piece of the puzzle snapped together with blinding clarity. The cryptic text message my mother Patricia had sent me the night before my wedding echoed loudly in my mind. "We have a sudden critical business project. Your wedding is a trivial event anyway, since no major investors will be there." It had not been a lie about the existence of a business project. It had been a deliberate lie of omission about whose project it was and who they were doing business with. The critical business project was Jamal securing this massive contract. My parents had skipped my wedding because Jamal was busy popping champagne over landing a $500,000 deal with the very corporation that employed me. The luxury vacation to Maui suddenly made perfect sense. The $30 mai tais, the private oceanfront cabanas, the coordinated linen outfits on the beach. It was not just a vacation funded by the money I had saved them on their mortgage. It was a premature victory lap. They were celebrating Jamal successfully conning a massive corporation. They believed their golden child and her husband had finally struck it rich. They thought Jamal had secured a fortune that would elevate their social status and validate all their terrible financial decisions over the past 3 years. They thought they had finally won. What none of them realized was that Jamal had accidentally pitched his fraudulent vaporware to the one corporation in North America, where I acted as the ultimate financial gatekeeper. He had walked his scam right through the front doors of my absolute domain. I sat in my high-backed leather chair, projecting absolute professional calm. Outwardly, I was simply a diligent risk manager reviewing a standard vendor presentation. Inwardly, I was experiencing the most profound sense of poetic justice I had ever known. They had ruined my wedding day to celebrate a business deal that I now held the sole legal authority to destroy. The director of procurement wrapped up his presentation and looked around the polished mahogany table. He asked the room if there were any final objections before they moved forward with officially releasing the $500,000 preliminary contract funds to Apex Nexus Solutions. I placed my digital tablet flat on the desk. I looked directly across the room and prepared to engage the full, devastating power of my corporate authority. I cleared my throat. The sound was sharp enough to slice through the comfortable corporate banter. The room fell entirely silent. Every executive turned their attention toward my end of the mahogany table. As the director of risk management, I have the final authorization on all third-party vendor integrations. I said, my voice projecting unwavering authority. I am officially placing a hard freeze on the Apex Nexus Solutions contract. All preliminary approvals are hereby suspended. No funds will be released. The director of procurement dropped his laser pointer, his face flushed with immediate frustration. He had staked his quarterly bonus on pushing this integration through quickly. "Clara, You cannot be serious, he protested, leaning over the table. This vendor was personally recommended by the Senior Vice President of Operations. They have promised a turnaround time that will save us millions in the next fiscal year. We have already negotiated the advanced payment structure. You are going to bottleneck the entire digital transition. I met his angry stare without blinking. A rushed integration with an unverified cloud algorithm poses a catastrophic threat to our proprietary data. I replied coldly, I do not care who recommended them on a golf course. My department operates on empirical data, not social networking, until I am absolutely certain that their infrastructure can withstand our security requirements. This contract is frozen. I am initiating an immediate and aggressive internal compliance audit. The procurement director opened his mouth to argue further, but the chief financial officer raised a hand to silence him. The CFO knew my track record. He knew I had saved the corporation from 2 massive liability lawsuits by catching vendor flaws early. He nodded in my direction, granting me the absolute authority to proceed. The meeting was adjourned. I packed up my tablet and walked out of the boardroom, feeling the heavy gaze of the frustrated executives burning into my back. They thought I was just being a rigid bureaucratic gatekeeper. They had no idea I was executing a highly personal and entirely legal demolition of a family member who had treated me like garbage. I returned to my corner office and locked the glass door. I sat down at my desk and pulled up the centralized vendor procurement portal. With my administrative credentials, I downloaded the entire submission packet for Apex Nexus Solutions. The file was massive, bloated with hundreds of pages of promotional material. I opened the documents and began to dig. I completely bypassed the flashy marketing jargon. I scrolled past the glossy stock photos of smiling tech workers and endless racks of server towers that Jamal had clearly purchased from an online image library. I ignored the ridiculous synergy diagrams and the pages of empty corporate promises about revolutionizing the insurance data space. I knew how Jamal operated. He was a master of the superficial. He built beautiful facades to hide rotting foundations. I did not care about the facade. I went straight for the structural core of the proposal. I opened the appendix labeled Data Security Compliance. To do business with a multi-billion-dollar financial institution, a vendor must prove they have an impenetrable digital fortress. They are required to hold top-tier cybersecurity certifications. Specifically, they need a SOC 2 Type 2 report and an ISO 27001 certification. These are not simple forms you can fill out online. They are grueling, rigorous, and highly regulated standards. I scrolled through Jamal Packet and found exactly what I was looking for. There they were. High-resolution PDF scans of a SOC 2 report and an ISO 2701 certificate. They looked incredibly professional. They featured official-looking watermarks, embossed seals, and the digital signatures of a purportedly independent auditing firm located in California. To a procurement executive who only cared about checking boxes on a list, these documents looked perfectly legitimate. But I was not a procurement executive. I was a risk manager, and I knew the man who submitted them. Jamal was an absolute grifter. I knew the intimate details of his financial reality. I knew he drove a leased car that he frequently struggled to make payments on. I knew his previous startup had collapsed in a spectacular firestorm of unpaid vendors and angry investors. I knew my parents had nearly lost their home trying to bail him out of his last legal disaster. More importantly, I understood the staggering cost of corporate cybersecurity. Obtaining genuine SOC to an ISO 27001 compliance is a monumental undertaking. It requires a company to hire external cybersecurity firms to conduct months of relentless penetration testing. It demands massive continuous investments in server infrastructure, data encryption protocols, and dedicated compliance personnel. The auditing process alone routinely costs tens of thousands of dollars, and maintaining the certification costs hundreds of thousands more. Jamal did not have that kind of capital. He did not have the operational infrastructure to support a real cloud data sorting algorithm, let alone the funds to secure a top-tier cybersecurity audit. He was operating this supposedly revolutionary tech company out of the spare bedroom in the house my parents rented from my secret LLC. The idea that he had suddenly acquired the resources to pass a legitimate international security audit was statistically impossible. My eyes narrowed as I focused on the PDF documents displayed on my high-resolution monitors. I zoomed in on the auditor signatures and the accreditation tracking numbers listed at the bottom of the certificates. They were perfectly aligned. The fonts were sharp. The seals looked authentic. I opened a secure terminal connected directly to federal and international accreditation databases. The insurance corporation maintained direct access to these registries to verify vendor claims instantly. I copied the alphanumeric certification ID number from Jamal's submitted ISO document. I pasted it into the search bar of the International Registry portal. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a fraction of a second. I thought about my mother lounging in a Hawaiian cabana, drinking cocktails purchased with my money. I thought about the 4 empty chairs at my wedding. I thought about the text message calling the happiest day of my life a trivial event. I pressed the enter key with forceful precision. The database initiated the search. The progress wheels spun on the screen, cross-referencing the certification number against the global directory of verified cybersecurity audits. I sat back in my leather chair, watching the screen process the query. I already knew what the result would be. I was simply waiting for the federal database to give me the definitive legal proof I needed to turn my suspicion into a corporate execution. The system chimed. The search results populated on the screen, illuminating the dark office with a bright white glare. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the mahogany desk, and began to read the official verification report. The web of lies Jamal had constructed to secure this $500,000 contract was about to be torn apart. Line by line. The screen displayed a stark, glaring error message in red text. Record not found. I leaned closer to the monitor. I ran the alphanumeric certification ID number a second time just to completely eliminate the possibility of a clerical error. The database returned the exact same response. The ISO certification number that Jamal had proudly submitted to our procurement department did not exist in the international registry. It was completely fabricated out of thin air. I moved on to the SOC-2 report. A legitimate SOC. 2 Type 2 audit is a grueling process that takes over 6 months of continuous monitoring by certified external security teams. I scanned the digital signature at the bottom of the document. It belonged to an auditing firm listed as Meridian Cyber Compliance based out of San Jose, California. I opened a new tab and accessed a specialized corporate background check software that our legal department utilized. I typed in the name of the auditing firm. The search results were immediately damning. Meridian Cyber Compliance was not an active auditing agency. According to the California Secretary of State Business Registry, the firm had filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy and completely dissolved its operations over 5 years ago. Jamal had not just fabricated a document. He had stolen the digital seal of a dead company and pasted it onto his fraudulent security report. I wanted absolute, undeniable proof that left no room for legal maneuvering. I downloaded the PDF files Jamal had submitted and ran them through a forensic metadata extractor. Metadata tells the hidden story of a digital file revealing exactly when and how it was created. The results were almost laughable in their amateurish execution. The files had not been generated by a secure corporate auditing server. The metadata proved that the PDFs had been created exactly 3 weeks ago using a basic consumer-level photo editing software. The software license was registered directly to Jamal's personal email address. He had literally sat in the spare bedroom of my parents' house and photoshopped fake federal security certificates. The sheer magnitude of his stupidity washed over me. In the Silicon Valley startup world, entrepreneurs often exaggerate their user metrics or inflate their revenue projections to attract venture capital. That is standard corporate posturing. But forging cybersecurity compliance documents to secure a vendor contract with a major financial institution is an entirely different reality. This was not a white lie. This was not a case of faking it until you make it. By transmitting these fraudulent documents across state lines via email to secure a $500,000 preliminary contract, Jamal had committed federal wire fraud. Each individual email containing the forged attachments constituted a separate federal offense. Furthermore, he was attempting to gain backdoor administrative access to the highly classified mainframes of a multi-billion-dollar insurance corporation. In the eyes of the federal government and corporate law, that level of unauthorized digital infiltration bordered on corporate espionage. If our procurement team had pushed this contract through without my intervention, Jamal unsecured software would have created a catastrophic vulnerability. He would have exposed the highly sensitive financial data, social security numbers, and medical records of millions of our policyholders to external hackers. I immediately initiated a strict chain of custody protocol for the evidence. I took high-definition screenshots of the Federal Registry displaying the invalid certification numbers. I downloaded the California state bankruptcy records proving the auditing firm was defunct. I exported the metadata logs showing Jamal's personal email address tied directly to the creation of the forged PDFs. I compiled every single piece of data into a highly encrypted digital dossier. I meticulously organized the dossier into a flawless chronological timeline. I included the initial vendor application, the falsified contracts, the fake security certificates, and the definitive proof of fraud. I attached a formal executive summary outlining the exact federal statutes Jamal had violated. The documentation was completely ironclad. There was no way Jamal could claim ignorance or blame a rogue employee. He was the sole proprietor of Apex Nexus Solutions, and his digital fingerprints were all over the forgery. I had him dead to rights. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the completed dossier resting securely on my desktop. The precision of my revenge was coming together perfectly. The trap was now fully loaded on two completely separate and devastating fronts. On the real estate front, my attorney Harrison was currently processing the demand letter that would trigger the foreclosure of my parents' home. They had breached the hardship clause by funding the lavish Hawaiian vacation, and their safety net was permanently gone. In exactly 30 days, they would face a ruthless corporate eviction. My mother and father would be stripped of the suburban mansion that defined their entire social identity. On the corporate law front, I now possess the exact documentation required to obliterate Jamal's fraudulent empire. I had the power to not only terminate his lucrative contract, but to expose him to massive civil liabilities and potential federal prosecution. The golden child husband, the man my family had celebrated while ignoring my wedding, was about to lose everything. Brittany would be forced to watch her carefully curated Instagram lifestyle collapse under the weight of federal fraud investigations. My toxic family thought they were absolutely untouchable. They believed they could skip my wedding, mock my life choices, and use my silent financial sacrifices to fund their arrogant narcissism. They were currently drinking $30 cocktails on a pristine beach, blissfully unaware of the catastrophic storm I had just engineered. I locked my computer terminal and stood up from my desk. The evidence-gathering phase was officially complete. It was time to execute the final corporate judgment. I picked up my encrypted tablet and walked out of my office. The corporate floor was humming with the late afternoon rush, but I moved through the space with singular purpose. I bypassed the standard administrative channels and headed directly for the executive suite of our chief legal officer. His name was Robert, a seasoned corporate attorney who had spent decades protecting this firm from massive liabilities. I did not knock on his assistant desk. I walked straight into his office and asked him to immediately summon the director of procurement. Robert saw the uncompromising look on my face and picked up his desk phone without asking a single question. Within 5 minutes, the director of procurement hurried into the room. He looked annoyed. likely assuming I was pulling him in to argue about standard vendor vetting timelines. He took a seat across from Robert and let out an impatient sigh. He demanded to know why we were holding an emergency meeting when he had a schedule full of quarterly reviews. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I placed my tablet in the center of the glass table and synced it to the large wall monitor. I told them that the preliminary contract they had fast-tracked for Apex Nexus Solutions was not a brilliant tech integration. It was a Trojan horse designed by a charismatic fraudster. The procurement director immediately bristled. He started to defend the vendor, repeating the same empty marketing buzzwords he had used in the morning meeting. He claimed that the senior vice president of operations had personally vouched for the founder. I cut him off completely. I pulled up the digital dossier on the screen. I displayed the high-resolution scans of the compliance certificates that Jamal had submitted. Then I displayed the Federal Registry error messages and the California state bankruptcy records for the auditing firm. I walked them through the metadata forensic report showing the exact timestamp when Jamal had used consumer-level photo editing software to forge the digital seals. The atmosphere in the room shifted from annoyed impatience to absolute horror. The blood drained entirely from the procurement director's face. He stared at the screen as the reality of the situation crashed down on him. He had championed this vendor. He had pushed to bypass standard security protocols to secure a quick win. He realized in that exact moment that he had nearly handed $500,000 of corporate funds to a criminal and exposed our entire proprietary mainframe to catastrophic unauthorized access. His career would not have just been terminated. He would have faced severe industry blacklisting. Robert leaned forward, resting his elbows on his desk. He was a man who rarely showed emotion, but his eyes were wide with shock. He looked at me and asked what stage the financial onboarding was in. The procurement director stammered, his hands shaking as he pulled up his own tablet. He admitted that the initial $50,000 advance payment was scheduled to clear the corporate escrow account at 5 o'clock that afternoon. It was currently 4:15. I did not wait for Robert to issue the order. I took complete control of the room. I advised corporate legal to immediately execute a hard termination of the contract. I specified that the termination must be classified as with cause, citing fraudulent documentation and gross misrepresentation. I ordered the procurement director to contact the accounting department and permanently freeze the $50,000 wire transfer. Not a single cent of our corporate capital would reach Jamal's bank account. Furthermore, I told Robert that we had a fiduciary duty to protect the broader financial sector. This was not a simple breach of contract. This was deliberate, premeditated fraud against a financial institution. I instructed corporate legal to prepare a comprehensive incident report and forward the entire encrypted dossier to the appropriate federal authorities. We were going to hand the FBI everything they needed to investigate Apex Nexus Solutions for wire fraud. Robert nodded in absolute agreement. He immediately picked up his phone and began barking orders to his legal team to freeze the funds and draft the termination notice. The procurement director sat frozen in his chair, looking at me with a mixture of absolute terror and profound gratitude. I had just saved his professional life by destroying my own brother-in-law. I left them to handle the bureaucratic execution. My part in the corporate demolition was completely finished. I returned to my corner office and gathered my belongings. I placed my laptop in my briefcase and turned off my dual monitors. The screens went dark, reflecting my calm expression. I walked out of the corporate headquarters and stepped into the cool evening air of downtown Chicago. The city was bustling with commuters rushing home to their families. I blended into the crowd. Just another successful executive finishing a highly productive workday. The train ride home was incredibly peaceful. I watched the city skyline fade into the residential neighborhoods. With every passing mile, the corporate shark persona receded, and I transitioned back into my life as a wife. I had spent the entire day meticulously dismantling the financial and housing security of the people who had abused me for years. The dual traps had been perfectly executed. Harrison was finalizing the foreclosure eviction notice for my parents, while corporate legal was drafting the fraud termination letter for Jamal. Both actions were irreversible. Both actions were completely legal. I unlocked the front door of our home and stepped inside. The house smelled amazing. David walked out of the kitchen wearing a casual sweater and a warm smile. He wrapped his arms around me and pulled me into a tight embrace. He asked me how my day was. I buried my face in his chest and told him it was the most satisfying Monday of my entire career. We ordered expensive takeout and sat together peacefully waiting for my phone to ring. Exactly 1 week had passed since the wedding. It was a Thursday evening, and the transition into married life had been wonderfully quiet. David and I were sitting at our kitchen island enjoying an extravagant spread of sushi we had ordered from his favorite spot in the city. The ambient lighting over the counter cast a warm glow across the room. David poured us both a glass of crisp white wine, and we talked about our upcoming honeymoon plans to Greece. The atmosphere was completely relaxed. I had spent the past few days successfully compartmentalizing the legal and financial bombs I had detonated at the corporate office. I knew the fallout was coming, but I was entirely prepared to weather the blast. My phone was resting face up on the polished quartz countertop near my wine glass. Right in the middle of a story David was telling about entirely prepared to weather the blast. My phone was resting face up on the polished quartz countertop near my wine glass. Right in the middle of a story David was telling about a new menu item he was developing for his restaurant. The screen suddenly lit up. The device began to vibrate against the stone surface, emitting a harsh rhythmic buzzing that cut through the tranquility of our evening. David stopped talking immediately. He set his chopsticks down and looked at the glowing screen. I did not move. I just stared at the name flashing in stark white letters. Caller ID, Richard. It had been exactly 7 days since my father chose to sit in a luxury Hawaiian cabana instead of walking me down the aisle. 7 days since he deemed my life a trivial event. And now he was calling me. David looked at me, his eyes narrowing with a familiar protective anger. He silently asked me with a tilt of his head if I wanted him to answer it, or if I preferred to simply decline the call and block the number. I shook my head slowly. I reached out and dragged the phone across the smooth quartz surface until it was sitting directly between us. I tapped the green accept button and instantly hit the speakerphone icon. I did not say a single word. I simply let the line open and waited for him to speak. Clara, are you there? My father's voice boomed out of the small phone speaker, echoing loudly in the quiet kitchen. It was a commanding, arrogant tone. It was the voice of a man who firmly believed the entire world revolved around his immediate needs and personal schedule. There was not a single ounce of hesitation in his delivery. There was absolutely no softness, no guilt, no remorse. He did not start the conversation by asking how I was doing. He did not ask how the wedding ceremony went. He did not offer a belated apology or fabricate an excuse for his absence. He did not even bother to offer a basic greeting. He simply spoke to me as if I was an incompetent administrative assistant who had failed to perform a routine task. Yes, I am here, I replied, my voice completely flat and devoid of any emotion. Well, it is about time you picked up. He huffed, letting out a loud, exasperated sigh that vibrated through the speaker. I have been trying to get this sorted out for the past hour, and your mother is breathing down my neck. I need you to call your bank right now and fix whatever glitch is happening with your account. David and I exchanged a long look across the kitchen island. David picked up his wine glass and took a slow, deliberate sip, leaning back in his chair to watch the spectacle unfold. What glitch are you referring to? I asked, keeping my tone perfectly even. The autopay, Richard snapped, his voice dripping with condescension. The automatic transfer we set up to pay the investment firm for the house. I just got an alert from my bank stating that the $1,500 electronic fund transfer bounced back. The system flagged it and said the receiving account actively rejected the deposit. I sat perfectly still, listening to his arrogant complaints. He was entirely oblivious to the fact that he was speaking directly to the owner of the investment firm holding his mortgage. "I do not have time to deal with banking errors this week," he continued, launching into a full-blown rant. "I have major things happening right now. Jamal just landed a massive corporate contract, and we are organizing a celebration dinner. The last thing I need is some automated banking system reporting a missed payment and dropping my credit score. You know how important a flawless credit profile is when you are dealing with high-level real estate assets." The sheer delusion required to make that statement was breathtaking. Richard's credit score was an absolute disaster. 3 years ago, he had decimated his financial standing to bail Jamal out of a lawsuit. He only had a roof over his head because I had secretly purchased his distressed debt and subsidized his life. Yet here he was lecturing me, a director of risk management at a multi-billion-dollar financial institution, about the importance of maintaining a flawless credit profile. "You need to get on the phone with your branch manager first thing tomorrow morning," Richard ordered. "Tell them to manually push the $1,500 through to the investment firm. Tell them to waive any late fees because this is clearly a routing error on their end. I will not be penalized because your bank upgraded their software and caused a processing glitch." He was speaking to me as if I was a child. He genuinely believed that he understood the complexities of automated clearinghouse transfers better than I did. He assumed that because I was his daughter, I was simply a vessel to execute his commands and fix his inconveniences. He thought this was just a minor technical hiccup that I would blindly resolve for him so he could go back to playing the wealthy patriarch at the country club. The absolute audacity of his demands hung in the air. He had completely bypassed the reality that he had skipped his daughter's wedding to drink cocktails in Maui. Instead, he was monopolizing my evening to order me to fix a non-existent bank error so he could continue living a subsidized lie. He was entirely consumed by the minor inconvenience of an electronic notification. He believed his primary issue was a simple software error. He had absolutely no idea that the rejection of that $1,500 payment was not a glitch. It was the calculated opening move of a financial execution. I remained perfectly silent for 5 seconds, letting his arrogant directives echo in the kitchen. I wanted him to feel the weight of the silence. I wanted to give him every possible opportunity to say something. Anything about my wedding. I waited to see if he would suddenly remember that I was a newlywed sitting in my home with my husband. He did not. His silence on the matter was profound and highly instructive. He truly did not care. "Are you there?" he barked again, his patience completely evaporating. "Clara, I said I need this handled immediately. Do not make me call you about this again. Just fix it. There is no glitch." "Richard," I said. My voice was a flat, unyielding line cutting through the static of the speakerphone. The bank did not make an error. The routing protocols are functioning exactly as they are designed to function. The system did not flag your payment by accident. I logged into the portal on Monday morning and I manually canceled your automated transfer. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a man whose brain was struggling to process a reality that completely contradicted his worldview. I could hear his shallow breathing through the speaker. I could picture him standing in his kitchen, his face turning a deep shade of crimson as the gears in his head violently jammed together. You did what he finally demanded. The sheer volume of his voice caused the audio on my phone to crackle and distort. I canceled the payment. I repeated enunciating every single syllable with lethal clarity. I revoked the authorization. The explosion was instantaneous. It erupted from the phone like a shockwave. Richard completely lost whatever thin veneer of civilized restraint he possessed. He began shouting at a deafening pitch, demanding to know what gave me the right to touch his banking arrangements. He accused me of being financially reckless, of overstepping my boundaries, of playing dangerous games with his credit score. He barked that I was a subordinate acting out of turn, and that I needed to immediately correct my massive mistake before he called my bank branch and reported me for unauthorized account tampering. I did not raise my voice. I did not interrupt him. I simply sat there with my hands folded on the quartz countertop and let the storm wash over me. When his initial rage failed to elicit an apology from me, he seamlessly pivoted to his favorite weapon: gaslighting. He immediately shifted the narrative to make himself the victim and me the unreasonable aggressor. "I know exactly what this is about," he sneered, his tone dripping with absolute disgust. "You are throwing a tantrum because of last weekend. You are deliberately sabotaging my financial standing because you are petty and vindictive over a trivial event." I took a slow, calm sip of my white wine. David was gripping the edge of the kitchen island so tightly his knuckles were turning white, but he stayed silent, trusting my process. "You are a 33-year-old woman acting like a spoiled toddler," Richard continued, his voice echoing with arrogant authority. "You are punishing your own parents because we had to prioritize a critical business venture over a simple party. You have absolutely no idea how the real corporate world works. Clara, you sit in your little cubicle pushing papers and obsessing over minor details while the rest of this family is out there making massive industry moves." He was picking up momentum now, entirely intoxicated by the sound of his own voice. He was building a grand delusion and inviting me to live inside it. "Jamal just secured a $500,000 contract with a major corporate entity," Richard bragged. "That is real success. That is life-changing capital that elevates this entire family. We went to Hawaii because we needed to celebrate a legitimate family milestone. It was a strategic networking retreat. We had to present a united affluent front to his investors and partners. Your little ceremony in a church was completely inconsequential compared to securing our family financial legacy. We made a sensible executive decision, and you are too incredibly selfish to see the bigger picture." I let him rant. In the field of corporate risk management, there is a fundamental rule regarding hostile negotiations. When an adversarial party is actively volunteering toxic information, you do not stop them. You do not argue. You do not correct their timeline. You simply sit back and let them exhaust their ammunition. You let them dig their own grave with their own words. I listened to him praise Jamal for securing a $500,000 contract, and I almost smiled. It took an incredible amount of physical discipline not to laugh out loud. Richard was boasting about a contract that I had personally terminated with cause just days ago. He was bragging about a business deal that was currently sitting on the desk of federal investigators. He was using a completely fraudulent startup as the justification for abandoning me at the altar. His entire reality was built on a foundation of sand, and he was standing on it screaming at me from the top of his lungs. He told me I was jealous of Brittany. He claimed I was bitter because she was living a life of luxury while I was working a rigid corporate job. I analyzed the sheer absurdity of his statement. Brittany was living a life of luxury because I was actively funding it. I was the silent benefactor keeping the roof over her head while she played pretend on social media. They were entirely dependent on the very daughter they were currently insulting. Richard went on to complain about how ungrateful I was. He detailed how much money they had spent raising me, how they had provided me with a good name, how I was constantly jealous of my sister. He claimed that my jealousy was a toxic trait that would eventually ruin my marriage with David. He stated that I was actively trying to destroy the family out of sheer spite because I could not handle the fact that Brittany and Jamal were infinitely more successful than I would ever be. I absorbed every single word. I did not shed a tear. I did not feel a single pang of guilt or heartbreak. His vicious rant did not break me. It only validated every single ruthless action I had taken on Monday morning. Every insult he hurled at me was just another piece of concrete reinforcing the boundary I had built between us. Finally, he began to run out of breath. His voice grew slightly. He had expended all his venom and was waiting for my reaction. He was waiting for my surrender. "Clara," he barked his tone, settling back into a commanding growl. "You are embarrassing yourself. You are embarrassing your husband. I am giving you one chance to make this right before I wash my hands of you completely. You will log back into that portal right now. You will reinstate the automatic payment, and you will write an email to the bank explaining that the cancellation was a mistake on your end. So, my credit report remains spotless. Do you understand me? The kitchen was dead silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. David looked at me, his eyes burning with intense anticipation. He knew the hammer was about to drop. I placed my wine glass down on the counter. The glass made a sharp clinking sound against the stone. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the island, bringing my face closer to the phone. The time for restraint was officially over. I had collected all his toxic admissions. I had let him exhaust his arrogant delusions. It was time to introduce him to the catastrophic reality of his situation. I waited for the exact right moment to speak. Richard broke the silence first, his voice echoing with absolute entitlement. I am waiting. Clara, you will reinstate that $1,500 payment immediately. You will fix this right now or you are completely cut off from this family forever. I took a deep breath. My delivery was perfectly measured, devoid of any anger or sorrow. I spoke with the icy precision of a corporate executive terminating a redundant asset. Do not contact me about trivial matters. Richard. From now on, any issues regarding your housing must be directed to your property management company. The line went dead silent. The cognitive dissonance was so intense I could practically hear his brain misfiring. He sputtered, letting out a sharp, confused bark of a laugh. What are you talking about, property management company? You hacked into my automated payments. You are the one messing with my bank account. I will call the investment firm tomorrow morning and tell them exactly what you did. I will have you arrested for financial tampering. You have no authority over my mortgage. I do not need to hack into your bank account. Richard, I replied, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. I did not tamper with anything. I simply logged into my own company portal and canceled the subsidy I have been gifting you for the past 3 years. What company? He demanded, his voice losing a fraction of its booming arrogance. What subsidy I own, the LLC? Richard, I stated. I let the words hang in the air. I let the absolute weight of that revelation crush the remaining oxygen out of his lungs. 3 years ago, when Jamal bankrupted you and the bank initiated foreclosure proceedings. No phantom investment firm stepped in to save you. I stepped in. I formed a blind, limited liability company. I used my own capital to purchase your distressed mortgage note directly from the bank. I am the sole owner of that LLC. That means I am your legal lender. I hold the deed to your house. I literally own the roof over your head. The silence that followed was entirely different from the previous pauses. This was not the silence of an arrogant man waiting for compliance. This was the paralyzing silence of prey, realizing the trap has just snapped shut. I continued driving the legal stake deeper, for 36 months. I allowed you to pay a heavily subsidized rate of $1,500. That fraction of a payment barely covered the annual property taxes. I absorbed the massive financial spread, losing my own investment capital so you and Patricia would not be thrown out onto the street. I instituted a strict good faith financial hardship clause to protect my investment. You signed it. You agreed that the discounted rate was contingent on your absolute financial distress. He tried to speak, but only a strangled, gasping sound came through the speaker. The booming patriarch had vanished. You breached the hardship clause. Richard, I said, executing the final sequence of my strategy. You took the thousands of dollars I silently saved you every month, and you used it to fund a luxury vacation to Hawaii for Jamal and Brittany. You used my money to drink $30 cocktails in an oceanfront cabana while explicitly telling me my wedding day was a trivial event. You violated the legal terms of our signed agreement. Clara, he whispered. His voice was trembling now. The arrogance was completely eradicated, replaced by naked, creeping terror. CL, please. Because you flagrantly violated the good faith agreement. I have permanently revoked your forbearance subsidy. I explained, moving relentlessly forward. I have reinstated your standard market interest rate retroactive to the date of the breach. Furthermore, I have officially invoked the acceleration clause. Your accelerated principal is now due in full. What does that mean? And he asked, his voice cracking. What acceleration clause? It means you owe me $300,000, I stated with lethal clarity. The entire remaining balance of your mortgage is due in exactly 30 days. There will be no negotiations. There will be no extensions. If the funds are not wired to my corporate escrow account by the end of the 30th day, my attorney will file the eviction paperwork. The county sheriff will physically remove you, Patricia, and every single piece of your furniture from my property. Clara, you cannot do this. He pleaded, the panic fully taking over. We do not have $300,000. Jamal just got that contract, but he has not been paid yet. We used our last available credit to pay for the flights to Maui. You are talking about making your own parents homeless. We will be on the street. Please, you have to undo this. We are your family. You made your choice when you boarded that plane. I replied, my voice unwavering. You prioritized an illusion of wealth over your own daughter. You celebrated a grifter instead of attending my wedding. Now you get to experience the real corporate world you claim to understand so well. Clara, please listen to me. He begged, his voice raising in sheer desperation. We can fix this. We can explain. Just do not do this to us. Check your mail. Richard, I said. The formal notice of intent to foreclose will arrive by certified courier tomorrow morning. Have a pleasant evening. I reached out and tapped the red button on the screen, ending the call. The connection severed instantly, leaving Richard stranded in a state of stunned. Terrifying silence miles away. The kitchen was incredibly still. The harsh static of the speakerphone was gone, replaced by the soft, ambient hum of the refrigerator. I picked up my wine glass and took a slow, satisfying sip. The wine tasted exceptionally crisp. David let out a long breath he had apparently been holding for the last 2 minutes. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of absolute awe and deep respect. He slowly shook his head, leaning back against the bar stool. He reached across the quartz countertop and gently took my hand, intertwining his fingers with mine. That he said quietly was the most brilliant and terrifying thing I have ever witnessed. I smiled, squeezing his hand. It was just basic risk management. I replied, you identify a liability, you assess the exposure, and you eliminate the threat. The first major domino had officially fallen. Richard and Patricia were currently standing in their suburban home, realizing that the walls around them belonged to the daughter they had spent a lifetime treating like a disappointment. Their false reality had been completely shattered, but the demolition was only halfway complete. The financial execution of my parents was secured. But I knew the blast radius was about to hit Jamal. The email from corporate legal was already scheduled. The destruction of his fraudulent empire was rapidly approaching, and there was absolutely nothing any of them could do to stop it. The next morning broke with a crisp chill that felt entirely appropriate for the legal avalanche I had just unleashed. While David and I were enjoying a quiet breakfast in our sunlit kitchen, an unmarked sedan pulled into the sprawling circular driveway of my parents' suburban estate. I knew the exact timing because Harrison, my corporate real estate attorney, had contracted a premium process server who provided real-time GPS tracking and delivery confirmation. At precisely 8:15 in the morning, the process server walked up the brick pathway and rang the doorbell. I could easily picture the scene unfolding. Richard and Patricia were likely nursing severe headaches from their frantic, sleepless night. They were probably still desperately hoping my phone call had been an elaborate bluff or a cruel prank. When Richard opened the heavy mahogany front door, he was not greeted by a friendly neighbor or a package delivery. He was met by a stern man in a tailored suit who asked him to confirm his identity. The moment Richard said yes, the server handed over a thick sealed manila envelope. The server stated he was legally serving a formal demand for payment and notice of intent to foreclose and evict. He then turned around and walked back to his car, leaving my father standing on his own porch, holding the physical manifestation of his financial ruin. My phone buzzed on the kitchen island exactly 10 minutes later. It was a new voicemail notification. David poured a fresh cup of dark roast coffee and slid it across the counter toward me. He leaned against the cabinets, crossing his arms, and gave me a knowing look. I did not pick up the phone. I tapped the screen to access my visual voicemail, allowing the audio to play out loud on speaker. The first message began with a sharp intake of breath. It was Patricia, and she was absolutely livid. "Clara, how dare you do this to your own mother?" Her voice shrieked through the speaker, vibrating with toxic entitlement. "A man just handed your father legal papers, threatening to throw us out on the street. You are out of your mind if you think you can pull a stunt like this. We gave you life. We raised you. We provided you with a respected family name. You are acting like a vicious, ungrateful monster. Call your father right now and apologize. You will call off these lawyers immediately, or you will never be welcome in this family again." The message ended with a loud, aggressive click. I took a sip of my coffee, letting the dark roast warm my throat. David raised an eyebrow. The classic narcissistic rage response he observed accurately. She is attempting to re-establish dominance by acting as if she still holds authority over you. She genuinely believes threatening to kick you out of the family is a punishment rather than a reward. I nodded in agreement. It was textbook psychological manipulation. She was ignoring the fact that she had already abandoned me at my wedding. She was trying to rewrite history to make herself the ultimate authority figure, who was simply disciplining a disobedient child. 15 minutes later. The phone buzzed again. A second voicemail. I tapped play. The tone had shifted drastically. The raging dictator was gone, replaced by a fragile, trembling victim. "Clara, please," Patricia whimpered, her voice cracking with manufactured tears. "I am shaking. My heart is palpitating. You know I have high blood pressure and this stress is going to send me to the hospital. How can you be so cruel to the woman who carried you? We are going to be homeless. Clara, we will be living out of our car. Your father is pacing the floors and he looks terrible. Jamal contract has not paid out yet, and we spent our last dollars flying to Hawaii because we thought we were celebrating a family victory. We have nothing left. Please, sweetie, just call me back. We can work this out like a family." I looked at David. The rapid pivot from aggressive insults to pathetic victimhood was staggering but entirely predictable. When intimidation fails, they immediately resort to guilt. Notice how she mentioned her blood pressure. I pointed out analyzing the audio like a corporate case study. She is laying the groundwork to blame me for any physical ailments she experiences. She is trying to make me responsible for her health, her housing, and her financial stability. And she conveniently admitted on a recorded line that they spent their remaining liquid assets on a luxury vacation, completely validating my legal grounds for terminating the hardship forbearance. David chuckled softly. She practically handed your attorney a taped confession. A third voicemail arrived an hour later. The panic had fully set in. The reality of the 30-day deadline outlined in the legal documents had finally penetrated their thick layer of delusion. Clara answered the phone. Patricia sobbed hysterically, her voice escalating into a frantic wail. "You cannot do this. We need this house. We have a reputation to maintain in this neighborhood. What will our friends think? What will the country clubs say when they see moving trucks taking away our furniture? You are humiliating us. You are ruining our lives over a stupid misunderstanding. I will do whatever you want. I will apologize for the wedding. Just stop the lawyers. Please stop them. That last message revealed the absolute core of her existence. She was not crying because she had hurt her daughter. She was not apologizing because she felt genuine remorse for skipping my wedding. She was completely hysterical because she was terrified of losing her social status. The thought of her country club friends witnessing her eviction was a fate worse than death. She offered a transactional apology only as a desperate bargaining chip to save her public image. I reached out and locked my phone screen. I had no intention of calling her back. Absolute radio silence was the only appropriate response. Engaging with them would only provide them with emotional supply. It would give them an opening to negotiate, to argue, to manipulate. By maintaining a strict no-contact boundary, I was starving them of the attention they desperately craved. I finished my coffee and stood up from the kitchen island. The morning sun was streaming through the large windows of our home, casting bright, warm light across the hardwood floors. My parents were currently trapped in a prison of their own making, desperately trying to claw their way out of a legally binding contract. They were screaming into the void while I was safely insulated behind an impenetrable wall of corporate lawyers and firm personal boundaries. I walked over to the sink and rinsed my mug, feeling an incredible sense of liberation. The real estate trap had closed perfectly. The antagonist's world was officially cracking wide open, and I did not have to lift another finger to finish the demolition. I just had to step back and watch the remaining pieces of their fraudulent lives crumble to the ground, while my parents were barricaded inside their suburban home, battling the reality of their impending eviction across town. My brother-in-law Jamal was completely oblivious to the financial apocalypse heading his way. In his mind, he was a conquering hero. He had just returned from the luxury Hawaiian vacation and was eager to flaunt his supposed success to his peers, to solidify his status as a newly minted tech mogul. He had rented a lavish penthouse loft in the trendy West Loop district of Chicago for the afternoon. He was hosting a highly curated catered brunch for his inner circle of tech bros and superficial investors. The atmosphere in the penthouse was suffocatingly pretentious. A private chef hired at an exorbitant hourly rate was preparing Wagyu steak and eggs at a massive marble kitchen island. Bottomless mimosas made with imported vintage champagne flowed freely into crystal flutes. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city skyline, a view Jamal was pretending he practically owned. The room was packed with men wearing expensive casual wear pitching cryptocurrency schemes and exchanging empty corporate buzzwords. Jamal was standing in the center of the loft holding court. He was still sporting a designer linen shirt he had purchased in Maui, looking deeply tanned and impossibly arrogant. He held a champagne flute in one hand and gestured wildly with the other as he recounted the story of his latest business conquest. He boasted loudly to his captive audience about how he had effortlessly finessed a $500,000 contract out of one of the largest insurance conglomerates in North America. He laughed openly as he described the corporate executives as slow-moving dinosaurs who practically handed him a blank check. He bragged about bypassing their entire bureaucratic vetting process simply by playing golf with the right vice president. He proudly announced that the initial $50,000 wire transfer was scheduled to hit his commercial bank account by the end of the business day. He was already soliciting advice from his friends on whether he should upgrade his leased luxury sedan to a custom-ordered imported sports car or put a down payment on a yacht for the summer. He was at the absolute peak of his hubris, floating on a cloud of fabricated success and stolen valor. He genuinely believed he had outsmarted the entire corporate financial system, right in the middle of a loud toast to his own genius. His phone vibrated violently in the pocket of his tailored trousers. He ignored it for a fraction of a second, wanting to finish his champagne. But the device buzzed again, then a third time. It was the distinct rhythmic vibration of a high-priority corporate email alert. Jamal smirked at his friends holding up a hand to pause the celebration. He pulled the sleek device from his pocket and tapped the screen confidently. He chuckled and told the crowd that it was probably his bank sending the automated confirmation that his $50,000 advance payment had officially cleared escrow. He unlocked the screen and opened his encrypted email client. The sender was not his commercial bank. The sender was the office of the chief legal officer at the exact insurance corporation he had just been mocking. Jamal's casual smile froze on his face. He read the subject line of the email and the color instantly drained from his cheeks. The text was formatted in stark, bold lettering. Subject: immediate termination of contract and notice of fraud investigation. He stepped away from the cheering crowd, moving toward the heavy glass windows of the penthouse. His thumb hovered over the screen, trembling slightly as he opened the body of the message. The email was not a standard corporate communication. It was a ruthless surgical legal execution. The document bypassed any professional pleasantries and immediately cited the exact termination clauses of his vendor agreement. The text boldly stated that the contract was terminated with extreme prejudice due to gross misrepresentation and the submission of fraudulent compliance materials. Jamal's heart began to hammer erratically against his ribs. He read the next paragraph and his breathing became shallow and rapid. The legal department detailed his exact crimes with terrifying precision. They explicitly named the defunct California auditing firm, Meridian Cyber Compliance. They stated that their internal risk management department had verified that the ISO certification number he provided did not exist in any international registry. The email then delivered the fatal blow. It outlined the forensic metadata extraction. The corporate lawyers explicitly noted that they possessed the digital timestamps proving Jamal had used consumer-level photo editing software, linked directly to his personal email address, to forge the federal security seals. He was reading a detailed summary of his own felony crimes. The email bluntly stated that the scheduled $50,000 advance payment had been permanently frozen and seized by corporate escrow. Furthermore, the legal team demanded the immediate return of any preliminary integration materials. The final paragraph was the one that completely shattered his reality. The chief legal officer informed him that due to the severe nature of the forged documents being transmitted to a major financial institution, the corporation was finalizing a comprehensive evidentiary dossier. That dossier was being formally submitted to the Federal Bureau of Investigation under suspicion of federal wire fraud and attempted corporate espionage. The crystal champagne flute slipped from Jamal's hand. It hit the polished hardwood floor and shattered into dozens of sharp, glittering pieces. The champagne splashed across the toes of his expensive designer loafers. A few of his friends turned around laughing and asking if he had already started the party a little too hard. Jamal did not answer them. He could not speak. His throat felt like it was closing up. The air in the luxurious penthouse suddenly felt impossibly thin. A massive, overwhelming panic attack seized his entire body. He was not going to buy an imported sports car. He was not going to buy a yacht. He was going to federal prison. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. The federal government does not negotiate with amateur grifters who forge cybersecurity documents to infiltrate multi-billion-dollar mainframes. They prosecute them to the fullest extent of the law. He staggered backward away from the broken glass. His vision began to blur at the edges. The loud thumping bass of the party music and the arrogant laughter of his friends faded into a muted, distorted ringing in his ears. He turned around and stumbled toward the exit of the penthouse. He did not grab his coat. He did not say goodbye to a single guest. He shoved the heavy front door open and burst into the quiet, carpeted hallway of the luxury building. He leaned his back against the cool, textured wallpaper and slid down until he was sitting on the floor, pulling his knees to his chest. He was hyperventilating, gasping for oxygen that his panicked lungs could not seem to process. His perfectly curated Instagram lifestyle, his arrogant tech bro persona, his entire fake empire was crumbling into digital dust right in front of his eyes. He sat alone in the hallway, gripping his phone as the absolute devastation of his fraudulent choices finally caught up to him. Jamal sat on the hallway floor, his chest heaving as he stared at the glowing screen of his smartphone. The panic was suffocating, but his survival instinct, honed by years of relentless grifting, began to desperately claw its way to the surface. He convinced himself this was just a massive administrative misunderstanding. He was a charismatic salesman. He had talked his way out of angry investor meetings, bounce checks, and broken leases before. He just needed to get the right person on the phone and spin a highly compelling narrative about a rogue contractor uploading the wrong files. He wiped the cold sweat from his forehead, unlocked his screen, and frantically scrolled through his contacts until he found the direct mobile number for the director of procurement. He pressed the call button and held the phone to his ear with trembling fingers. The line rang twice before the connection clicked open. Jamal did not wait for a formal greeting. He immediately launched into his practiced, fast-talking pitch. He forced a strained artificial chuckle and told the executive there had been a catastrophic administrative error on his end. He claimed he had recently fired a disgruntled junior software developer who must have maliciously uploaded draft versions of their compliance certificates instead of the official finalized documents. He begged the director to pause the termination, promising to personally handle the correct authenticated paperwork to the corporate office by Monday morning. He pleaded for a second chance, desperately reminding the director of the incredible synergy and mutual profits they had discussed on the golf course. The procurement director did not interrupt him. He let Jamal spin his desperate, pathetic web of lies for 2 full minutes. When Jamal finally paused to take a ragged breath, the executive spoke. His voice was completely devoid of the friendly golf course camaraderie they had shared just weeks prior. It was absolute freezing corporate ice. The executive told Jamal to stop talking immediately. He explicitly warned Jamal that any further communication would be forwarded directly to federal prosecutors as evidence of ongoing fraud and obstruction. He informed Jamal that the internal compliance audit had not been a random system flag or a simple clerical review. It was a targeted, aggressive, and highly specialized investigation launched by the highest level of their corporate security team. Jamal swallowed hard, his throat completely dry. He tried to invoke the name of the senior vice president of operations, hoping to use his flimsy social connection as a protective shield. The procurement director let out a harsh, mocking laugh. He told Jamal that the senior vice president had already recused himself from the entire situation to save his own career from the collateral damage. The executive then delivered the final fatal blow. He told Jamal that no amount of golfing or smooth talking would save him because the forensic audit had been personally executed, finalized, and signed off by their director of risk management. Jamal asked who that was, his voice dropping to a terrified, shaking whisper. The procurement director paused, ensuring the weight of the moment landed with maximum devastation. He stated her full name, Clara. He specified that Clara was the absolute unquestioned authority on corporate vendor integration, and she was the executive who had meticulously packaged his forged metadata into an ironclad dossier for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The executive hung up the phone, the dial tone blaring loudly against Jamal's ear. The name echoed in his mind, shattering every single delusion of grandeur he had left. Clara, his sister-in-law. The woman he and Brittany had mocked relentlessly for being a boring corporate drone. The woman whose wedding they had deliberately skipped just 7 days ago so they could drink imported champagne on a Hawaiian beach. He remembered standing in the oceanfront cabana, holding up his glass and laughing with Richard about how trivial her little ceremony was compared to his massive corporate success. He remembered bragging about securing a $500,000 contract with a major Chicago insurance firm. He had never bothered to ask exactly what position Clara held at her company. He just assumed she was a mid-level paper pusher who updated spreadsheets and attended meaningless meetings. The horrifying reality crashed over him like a tidal wave of ice water. Clara was not a paper pusher. She was the apex predator of the corporate food chain. She was the director of risk management. He had unknowingly walked his fraudulent, amateurish scam directly into her highly secure domain. She had sat in her office, watched him submit forged federal documents, and quietly locked the steel doors behind him. She had let him fly to Maui, let him celebrate his fake victory, let him skip her wedding, all while she was meticulously building a federal wire fraud case against him. It was not a coincidence. It was a flawless, cold-blooded execution. Jamal scrambled to his feet, his designer loafers slipping slightly on the carpeted floor. Total, absolute terror seized his mind. He abandoned the luxury penthouse, leaving the heavy front door wide open. He ignored the expensive private chef, the bottomless mimosas, and his confused, cheering tech bros. He sprinted down the hallway toward the private elevator, frantically mashing the call button with his fist. He needed to find Brittany. He needed to find Richard and Patricia. If Clara had the power to federally annihilate his company with a few keystrokes, he knew she was not going to stop there. He burst out of the luxury apartment building and practically threw himself into his least luxury sedan. He slammed his foot on the accelerator, tearing through the downtown Chicago traffic. His hands gripped the leather steering wheel so tightly his joints ached. His heart was hammering violently against his ribs as he blew through yellow lights and swerved aggressively onto the highway, heading straight for the wealthy suburbs. He was driving frantically toward Richard and Patricia's sprawling estate, completely consumed by panic. He was entirely unaware that his catastrophic corporate downfall was about to violently collide with the very real estate crisis Clara had triggered that exact same morning. The separate traps were closing and they were all rushing directly into the center of the blast radius. Jamal slammed his foot on the brake pedal, causing his least luxury sedan to skid violently across the circular driveway of the sprawling suburban estate. He did not care that his tires were tearing deep gashes into the perfectly manicured lawn. He threw the car into park, leaving the engine running, and sprinted toward the heavy mahogany front door. He burst into the foyer without knocking, completely consumed by his own impending federal ruin. The scene inside the house was already one of absolute chaotic devastation. Patricia was hyperventilating on the designer living room sofa, clutching the formal demand for payment in her trembling hands. Richard was pacing the length of the hardwood floor, his face a dangerous shade of crimson as he muttered aggressive threats to nobody in particular. Brittany was curled up in an armchair, crying hysterically. Her parents had just confessed that they were completely broke, that the house was being foreclosed on, and that her entire affluent lifestyle was effectively over. Brittany looked up as Jamal burst into the living room. For a brief second, her tear-stained face lit up with desperate hope. She fully expected her husband to announce that his $500,000 contract deposit had officially cleared corporate escrow so they could magically bail her parents out of this nightmare. Instead, Jamal collapsed against the doorframe, looking like a man marching to the gallows. He gasped for air and stammered out that his entire world was over. He told them the corporate contract was completely terminated. The massive advanced payment was permanently frozen. The legal department was preparing a comprehensive dossier to submit to the federal authorities for wire fraud. Richard stopped pacing. He stared at his son-in-law, demanding to know how a guaranteed tech integration falls apart in a single hour. He asked who authorized the termination. Jamal looked at his father-in-law and said the name that would haunt all of them forever. Clara. He told them Clara was the director of risk management. He explained that she had personally audited his company, bypassed his marketing pitch, and executed a targeted legal strike against his infrastructure. The color drained entirely from Richard's face. He looked down at the eviction notice resting on the coffee table. The pieces of the puzzle aggressively slammed together with sickening clarity. The anonymous blind limited liability company. The sudden $1,500 subsidized payments 3 years ago. The immediate and ruthless termination of the hardship clause the exact morning after they returned from Hawaii. Clara was not just the corporate executive destroying Jamal. Clara was the faceless bank evicting them from their home. The living room descended into a toxic feedback loop. A normal family would have realized they had crossed a fatal line. A normal group of people would have acknowledged that forging federal cybersecurity documents and breaching a binding financial contract to buy tropical cocktails were terrible illegal decisions. But this group was entirely incapable of taking accountability. Instead, They instantly weaponized their collective delusion and constructed a brand new echo chamber to protect their fragile egos. Patricia declared loudly that Clara had suffered a complete psychological breakdown. She wiped her face and claimed that Clara had always been deeply jealous of Brittany since they were children. Brittany nodded eagerly, leaning into her role as the perpetual victim. She insisted Clara was just a bitter, vindictive woman who could not handle the fact that Brittany had a perfect marriage and a thriving social media presence. They convinced each other that Clara was lashing out purely because she was miserable in her own life. Jamal immediately jumped on the bandwagon, desperate to hide his own criminal incompetence. He loudly insisted his software was genuinely revolutionary. He claimed Clara was deliberately abusing her corporate authority to sabotage a highly successful black-owned business out of pure spite. He framed his own federal wire fraud as a brilliant entrepreneurial strategy that Clara was too small-minded to understand. Richard paced faster, fueling his own arrogant rage. He convinced himself that Clara was operating entirely outside the law. He deluded himself into believing that an eviction notice from an LLC was just a fake legal threat designed to extort them. He refused to accept that the daughter he had treated like a subordinate had financially outsmarted him. Richard slammed his fist hard on the glass coffee table. He announced that he was going to call his attorneys right now to crush Clara in court. He bragged that he would have her fired from her corporate job and thrown in jail for financial tampering. Jamal instantly panicked. The absolute last thing Jamal needed was competent legal counsel reviewing his forged ISO certificates. Jamal practically begged Richard to keep lawyers out of it, claiming corporate litigation would tie up his startup capital in injunctions for years. Richard begrudgingly agreed, silently relieved. Richard knew he literally did not have a single dollar left to pay a legal retainer. They had spent their absolute last cent on the Maui vacation. They were entirely bankrupt, completely guilty, and backed into a corner, fueled by sheer desperation and staggering entitlement. Richard formulated a catastrophic plan. He declared that Clara was still just his quiet, obedient daughter. He believed she was hiding behind corporate emails and process servers because she was too weak to face him directly. He told the room that if they confronted her in person, she would immediately fold under the pressure of his patriarchal authority. Patricia agreed, wiping her eyes and straightening her posture. She claimed that Clara just needed to be reminded of her place in the family hierarchy. They decided they would drive directly to her house right now. They planned to corner her in her own living room. They intended to physically intimidate her into logging back into her laptop to reverse the eviction notice and reinstate the corporate vendor contract. They genuinely believed they could bully a director of risk management into total submission just by raising their voices. They grabbed their coats and stormed out to the driveway, leaving the front door wide open behind them. They piled into their vehicles, acting like righteous victims marching into battle. They were a toxic caravan of delusional narcissists heading straight for a solid brick wall. The collision happened on Saturday morning. The toxic caravan had spent the entire night feeding their collective delusions, whipping themselves into a frenzy of misplaced righteous indignation. They had likely paced the floors of my parents' soon-to-be foreclosed suburban estate, drafting a battle plan built entirely on empty threats and sheer arrogance. They wanted an audience. They wanted a public spectacle where they could weaponize guilt and shame to force me into immediate submission. The air was crisp and cool. I was out in my front yard, kneeling in the dark soil, tending to the rose bushes I had meticulously planted with David last spring. The quiet peace of the affluent suburban morning was violently shattered by the loud screeching of tires. 3 separate vehicles, aggressive and completely uncoordinated, swerved onto my pristine driveway. Doors slammed shut with explosive force echoing down the peaceful street. Richard, Patricia, Brittany, and Jamal marched across my manicured lawn like an invading army. They did not bother to walk up the paved stone pathway. They trampled directly over the blooming hydrangeas, their faces twisted into masks of furious entitlement. David was inside the house finalizing payroll for his restaurant chain, but I did not call out for him. I did not need my husband to protect me from this particular threat. I slowly stood up from the flower bed, brushing the loose potting soil from the knees of my jeans. I pulled off my heavy gardening gloves and stood on my front porch, looking down at the 4 people who had terrorized me for a lifetime. They looked absolutely unhinged. Jamal and Brittany immediately led the charge, completely bypassing Richard and his usual patriarchal bluster. Jamal marched right up to the bottom step of my porch, pointing a shaking, aggressive finger directly at my face. He did not lead with a desperate apology or a plea for financial mercy regarding the frozen $500,000 contract. He immediately launched into a loud theatrical performance specifically designed to draw the attention of my wealthy neighbors, who were beginning to step out onto their porches to watch the commotion. He screamed that I was a racist. He loudly accused me of deliberately and maliciously racially profiling his business enterprise. He shouted that I had targeted a highly successful Black-owned startup out of pure, unadulterated spite. He claimed I was a bitter, bigoted corporate drone who could not stand to see a man of color succeed and generate generational wealth. While my own husband was just a lowly cook slinging food, Brittany stood right behind him, nodding emphatically and yelling that I was a disgusting, prejudiced woman who was abusing corporate power to oppress minorities. Jamal escalated his threats, puffing out his chest to look physically imposing. He promised to call the local Chicago news stations immediately. He threatened to take his fabricated story of racial discrimination to the national press to blast my name and my face across every social media platform on the internet. He swore he would orchestrate a massive public boycott of my corporate insurance firm. He looked me dead in the eye and guaranteed that he would completely ruin my career, have me fired by Monday morning, and ensure I was permanently blacklisted from the entire financial sector for discriminatory corporate sabotage. I did not flinch. I did not take a single step back. I did not raise my voice or attempt to argue with his completely manufactured outrage. As a director of risk management, I understood that when a fraudster is backed into a corner, they will always deploy the most explosive social ammunition they can find to distract from their own criminality. I had fully anticipated this exact confrontation. I calmly reached into the deep front pocket of my canvas gardening apron. I pulled out a neatly folded piece of high-quality printer paper. It was a high-resolution physical hard copy of the forged ISO 2701 certificate he had foolishly submitted to my corporate procurement department. I slowly unfolded the document, smoothing out the creases, and held it out, steadying it in the gentle morning breeze. I pointed a soil-stained finger directly at the digital signature of the defunct California auditing firm located at the bottom of the page. I looked Jamal dead in the eyes, piercing right through his arrogant facade. Federal wire fraud has no race. Jamal, I stated, my voice ringing out with lethal absolute clarity. You lied to a financial institution. You submitted forged federal cybersecurity documents using consumer-level photo editing software linked directly to your personal email address. You stole the digital seal of a company that went bankrupt 5 years ago, and you attempted to use it to infiltrate a multi-billion-dollar corporate mainframe. Jamal froze. The loud, aggressive shouting died instantly in his throat. I stepped closer to the edge of the porch, holding the forged evidence right in front of his face. You are not a victim of racial profiling, Jamali continued mercilessly. You are a highly incompetent criminal who committed corporate espionage. You are lucky I only terminated the contract instead of having you arrested today. The corporate legal department has already forwarded your entire metadata dossier to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. You should not be standing on my lawn threatening me with the local news. You should be calling a federal defense attorney because you are going to prison. The transformation was instantaneous and utterly pathetic. The loud, threatening tech bro vanished completely. Jamal instantly deflated his shoulder, slumping forward as the oxygen was sucked entirely out of his lungs. He stared at the piece of paper in my hand, realizing with absolute terrifying certainty that I was completely bulletproof. He had tried to play a heavy societal trump card against a woman who held his literal federal prison sentence in her apron pocket. He took a stumbling, staggering step backward, physically hiding behind Brittany, as the reality of his impending federal prosecution crushed him. He realized that calling the press would only broadcast his felony crimes to the entire world. His grandiose threats of ruining my career dissolved into the morning air, leaving him exposed as nothing more than a terrified grifter who had just triggered his own demise. The absolute silence that followed Jamal retreating behind his wife was deafening. The mighty tech entrepreneur had been reduced to a cowering shell attempting to hide behind Brittany. Seeing her husband complete capitulation, Patricia realized their offensive assault had failed miserably. The loud corporate intimidation tactic was dead on arrival. She immediately pivoted to the only other weapon left in a narcissist arsenal. She deployed her theatrical emotional manipulation. Patricia pushed her way past Jamal and Brittany, her face contorted into a mask of exaggerated agony. Huge artificial tears welled up in her eyes and began spilling down her carefully contoured cheeks. She let out a loud, dramatic sob that sounded more like a rehearsed stage performance than an expression of genuine human sorrow. She practically lunged toward the porch steps, reaching her arms out wildly, attempting to physically grab my hands and force me into a submissive, comforting embrace. "Clara, we are your family," Patricia wailed, her voice breaking with calculated precision. "How can you do this to us? How can you stand there and put your own parents on the street? We gave you everything. We raised you. How can you be so cold-hearted and ruin your sister's life over a simple misunderstanding? We are flesh and blood. Clara, you cannot destroy us like this." I took a swift, deliberate step backward, ensuring her grasping hands caught nothing but empty air. I absolutely refused to let her cross my physical boundary. I looked down at her fake tears with total clinical detachment. The sheer hypocrisy of her emotional performance was staggering. She was begging for familial loyalty from the daughter she had gleefully abandoned just 1 week prior. I did not raise my voice. I did not match her hysterical energy. I simply held up a mirror to her grotesque entitlement and reflected her own vile behavior right back at her. "You spent my money on tropical Mai Tais while my husband and I looked at empty mahogany chairs." I said my words were sharp and absolute, slicing right through her fabricated sobbing. "You funded a luxury Hawaiian vacation using the thousands of dollars I silently saved you every single month. You sent me a text message explicitly calling the most important day of my life a trivial event. You demanded that I not bother you while you celebrated the very fraudster standing behind you." Patricia tried to stammer out an excuse, but I cut her off completely, refusing to yield a single inch of ground. "I am not ruining your life. Mother," I continued, maintaining my icy composure, "I am not destroying your housing security. I am simply taking back my capital. I am revoking the financial charity you actively abused. You breached a legally binding contract to fund a fake affluent lifestyle, and now you are facing the standard corporate consequences. There is no misunderstanding here. You made a calculated choice to prioritize your own vanity over your daughter, and now the bill is due." The cold, undeniable logic of my response shattered Patricia's victim narrative. She realized her tears held absolutely zero currency here. She stopped crying instantly, her face dropping the mask of sorrow and twisting into an ugly, bitter scowl. She had no counter-argument. The truth was an impenetrable wall she could not cry her way through. Watching his wife fail to emotionally manipulate me was the final breaking point for Richard. His fragile patriarchal ego could not handle the reality that his quiet, obedient daughter was systematically destroying his entire world. He could not process the fact that I held absolute financial and legal dominance over him. His arrogant mind short-circuited completely, and he immediately resorted to the lowest form of primitive intimidation. Richard let out a furious animalistic roar. He shoved past Patricia and stomped heavily up the wooden steps of my porch. His face was a dark, dangerous purple. The veins in his neck bulged against his stiff collar. He stepped aggressively into my personal space, attempting to use his physical size to tower over me and force me to submit to his authority. "You listen to me, you disrespectful little brat!" Richard bellowed, his spit flying through the crisp morning air. "You will not speak to your mother that way. You will drop this ridiculous eviction stunt. And you will reinstate Jamal contract. Right this second. I am your father. I demand your respect. You will do exactly as you are told, or I will make you regret the day you were born." He raised his hand, clenching his fist as if preparing to strike or grab me by the collar. He wanted to physically terrorize me into compliance. He wanted to bully the corporate executive back into the role of a frightened child. I did not flinch. I held my ground, staring directly into his furious eyes. I knew I was not alone. Before Richard could take another aggressive step, the heavy oak front door of my house swung wide open. David stepped out onto the porch. He did not rush. He moved with a terrifying, calm menace that instantly froze the air around us. My husband was a man who worked in high-stress culinary environments, running busy commercial kitchens. He was physically imposing and fiercely protective of our sanctuary. David positioned himself seamlessly between me and my father, inserting his broad shoulders as a physical barricade. He did not yell. He did not engage in Richard's chaotic shouting match. He simply held up his smartphone. The screen was brightly lit, showing an active call timer. "Step off my property," Richard David commanded. His voice was a low, dangerous rumble that borked absolutely zero debate. "You are trespassing and you are actively threatening my wife. I have already called the police. I am on the line with the dispatcher right now. Patrol cars are currently en route and will be pulling into this driveway in less than 2 minutes." David lowered the phone slightly, allowing the clear, authoritative voice of the emergency dispatcher to bleed into the open air, asking for confirmation of our address. The audio was undeniable proof that David was not bluffing. He had initiated a formal police response the moment he saw Richard march up the driveway. Richard froze, his raised fist hovering uselessly in the air. The sudden appearance of my husband and the immediate threat of law enforcement completely neutralized his aggressive momentum. He looked at David broad-chested, and then down at the glowing phone screen. The surrounding neighborhood was completely awake now. Several wealthy neighbors had stepped out onto their manicured lawns, holding their morning coffee cups, watching the entire humiliating spectacle unfold. Richard was a man who worshipped social status and public appearances. The thought of being thrown into the back of a flashing squad car while the entire affluent subdivision watched was completely paralyzing. He slowly lowered his fist, his aggressive posture collapsing as the sheer weight of his impending public humiliation finally registered in his arrogant mind. He took a slow, shaky step backward, completely defeated by the reality of his own actions. The distant wail of sirens shattered the tense silence hanging over our front lawn. Within seconds, 2 local squad cars turned the corner of our street, their red and blue lights flashing brilliantly against the morning sun. The vehicles pulled up aggressively, parking at an angle that completely blocked the end of our driveway, ensuring my family vehicles could not easily retreat. 4 uniformed officers stepped out of their cruisers, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts as they rapidly assessed the volatile situation. David did not miss a single beat. He immediately walked down the porch steps, maintaining a calm, authoritative demeanor. He approached the lead officer and introduced himself as the homeowner. He gestured directly toward the clear property line, marking where the public sidewalk ended and our private driveway began. He stated firmly that these 4 individuals were trespassing on private property, that they had arrived uninvited, and that the older man had just attempted to physically threaten his wife. The lead officer nodded, absorbing the information while motioning for his partners to fan out and secure the perimeter. He turned his attention to Richard, who was still standing awkwardly near the bottom of our porch stairs. The officer ordered Richard to step backward off the grass and keep his hands entirely visible. The absolute public humiliation of the moment crashed down on my family like a suffocating avalanche. Our affluent subdivision was fully awake now. Neighbors from across the street and adjacent properties had gathered on their manicured lawns, watching the spectacle unfold with intense curiosity. Some were openly holding their smartphones, recording the entire humiliating encounter. Patricia was absolutely mortified. The woman who had spent her entire adult life obsessing over country club status and carefully cultivating an image of flawless aristocratic wealth was now the main attraction of a suburban police raid. She desperately tried to hide her face behind her designer handbag, shrinking away from the flashing police lights. She knew with terrifying certainty that the neighborhood gossip mill would completely destroy her social standing before noon. There was no recovering from having law enforcement physically remove you from your own daughter lawn. Richard, however, was entirely incapable of accepting defeat gracefully. His fragile narcissistic ego simply could not process the reality of being treated like a common trespasser. Instead of complying with the simple police directive, he decided to argue. He puffed out his chest and stepped toward the lead officer, attempting to leverage his usual patriarchal intimidation tactics. He loudly declared that this was a ridiculous misunderstanding. He claimed that he was a respectable businessman trying to have a private conversation with his disobedient daughter. He ordered the police to leave his property, stating they were overreacting to a minor family dispute. It was a spectacular display of staggering arrogance, and it backfired instantly. The lead officer did not care about Richard's perceived social status. He cared about securing a hostile scene. The officer's voice dropped to a sharp, commanding bark. He informed Richard that he was not on his own property, and that if he did not step back onto the public sidewalk immediately, he would be placed in handcuffs for aggressive behavior and trespassing. Richard's face drained of color. The threat of actual physical arrest finally pierced through his thick layer of delusion. He looked at the officer's unyielding expression and realized his intimidation tactics were completely useless here. He slowly backed away, his hands raised in a pathetic gesture of surrender, stumbling over the edge of the flower bed as he retreated toward the street. He looked incredibly small and foolish, a broken dictator stripped of his imaginary kingdom. Jamal and Brittany were faring no better. Jamal, who had been so eager to play the victim of corporate discrimination just minutes ago, was now trying to silently melt into the background. He slowly shuffled toward his least luxury sedan, hoping the police would ignore him. One of the backup officers immediately pointed a flashlight in his direction, ordering him to stay exactly where he was until the scene was cleared. Jamal froze instantly. His tech bro swagger entirely evaporated. Brittany was sobbing quietly, her mascara running down her face, completely stripped of her curated influencer persona. They were all trapped, illuminated by the flashing police lights, and exposed to the harsh reality of their own actions. I remained standing on the elevated porch, looking down at the four of them. I felt no pity. I felt no remorse. I felt only the clean, sharp precision of justice finally being served. I walked forward until I was standing at the very edge of the top step. I looked directly into Richard's eyes, ensuring he heard every single syllable I was about to deliver. "You have exactly 20 days left to pay the $300,000, I stated, my voice carrying clearly across the quiet morning air. The countdown has not stopped. The corporate legal machinery is already in motion. If the funds are not fully cleared in my account by the deadline, the eviction will proceed immediately. I will not be the one standing on your lawn arguing with you. The county sheriff will be the one moving your furniture onto the curb and changing the locks on your doors." I shifted my gaze to Patricia, then to Brittany, and finally to Jamal. I made sure each of them understood the absolute finality of my next words. "Do not ever approach my home again," I commanded. "Do not call my phone. Do not send emails. Do not attempt to use other relatives to pass along your desperate apologies. You are no longer welcome in my life. You are simply a defaulted loan and a terminated vendor contract. This is the last time we will ever speak. The lead officer turned to Richard and instructed him to gather his family and leave the premises immediately. He explicitly warned them that if they returned or attempted to contact us again, David and I would be fully within our rights to file formal restraining orders and pursue criminal harassment charges. The defeat was total and absolute. There was no final argument. There was no dramatic parting shot. My parents, sister, and brother-in-law turned around and walked silently toward their vehicles. They moved like ghosts, completely stripped of their power and their pride. They climbed into their cars, the heavy doors shutting with a hollow thud. The engines roared to life, and they slowly drove away under the watchful escort of the 2 police cruisers. I stood on the porch with David, watching the taillights disappear down the winding suburban street. The flashing red and blue lights faded into the distance, leaving our neighborhood in peaceful silence once again. The air felt remarkably clean. I turned to my husband and we walked back inside our home, closing the heavy oak door and locking it firmly behind us. Exactly 30 days later, the legal deadline expired at the stroke of midnight. There was no miraculous financial rescue for my parents. The reality of their situation was a mathematical impossibility. Richard and Patricia had spent the entire month frantically visiting every commercial bank and private lender in the greater Chicago area, desperately trying to secure a $300,000 loan to save their estate. They were universally rejected. Their credit profiles were absolute toxic waste, resulting from years of reckless spending and the massive debt they had previously accumulated to bail Jamal out of his first failed venture. Any hidden assets they might have possessed were completely drained. They had nothing left to leverage. The foreclosure proceeded with ruthless mechanical efficiency. My corporate real estate attorney executed the final eviction orders without a single delay. On the 31st morning, a county sheriff deputy pulled up to the sprawling suburban estate my parents had weaponized for so long. The deputy stood on their manicured front porch and officially oversaw the removal of their property. My parents were forced to watch as a discount moving company carried their expensive furniture out the front door, loading it into the back of a rented truck. The neighbors who had witnessed the police incident at my house weeks earlier watched from their windows as the final curtain fell on my parents' carefully curated illusion of wealth. Richard and Patricia were forced to move into a tiny, rundown 2-bedroom apartment on the far outskirts of the city. It was a massive downgrade from their sprawling estate. The apartment building featured peeling paint-stained hallway carpets and a distinct lack of the country club prestige my mother so desperately craved. Their wealthy friends immediately stopped returning their phone calls. The social exile was absolute. My mother was stripped of the only thing she truly valued, which was her public image. She was forced to live out her days in a cramped space surrounded by boxes of expensive clothes she had nowhere to wear. The karmic justice extended far beyond the real estate market, across the city. Jamal's fraudulent tech empire completely collapsed under the crushing weight of a federal inquiry. The dossier I submitted to corporate legal triggered a massive industry-wide alert. Jamal was officially blacklisted from the entire financial and technology sector. No legitimate corporation would ever allow him past their lobby doors. The Federal Bureau of Investigation formally opened a case into his forged cybersecurity documents and the wire fraud he committed. He was facing staggering federal fines and the very real possibility of a lengthy prison sentence. His leased luxury cars were quietly repossessed in the middle of the night. My sister Brittany experienced a downfall just as devastating. Her entire identity was built on projecting a flawless, wealthy lifestyle to her thousands of social media followers. The moment Jamal fraud was exposed and the money completely dried up, her glamorous influencer persona died instantly. Her Instagram account went completely silent. There were no more posts about luxury vacations, designer handbags, or exclusive brunch spots. She was forced to face the harsh reality of her choices. Trapped in a marriage with a disgraced grifter and entirely alienated from the only sister who could have ever offered her genuine help. Her perfect image was permanently shattered, leaving nothing but the hollow shell of a woman who had traded her family for a fake aesthetic. As their worlds burned to the ground, my life elevated to new heights. 6 months after the eviction, I was sitting in the ultra-exclusive VIP section of David Newest and most successful boutique restaurant. The ambiance was incredible, featuring soft jazz, dim lighting, and the low hum of successful people enjoying their evening. David was standing by the bar, chatting effortlessly with a group of investors while I sat at our private table bathed in absolute peace. I picked up my smartphone and looked at the screen. It was delightfully quiet. There were no frantic voicemails, no manipulative text messages, and no demands for financial bailouts. Every single toxic number associated with my biological family was permanently blocked. They had no way to reach me, and I had absolutely no desire to ever check on them. I opened my encrypted banking application and logged into my blind limited liability company dashboard. The final numbers from the real estate transaction had just cleared escrow, after the sheriff had evicted my parents. I immediately put the suburban estate on the open market, because it was located in a highly desirable neighborhood. It sparked a massive bidding war among wealthy buyers. The house sold for significantly over the asking price. I did not just recover my initial investment. I walked away with a massive, unprecedented profit margin. I had transformed years of financial abuse into a highly lucrative corporate acquisition. David walked over to our table holding 2 crystal flutes filled with vintage champagne. He sat down across from me, his eyes shining with profound love and unwavering respect. He handed me a glass and raised his own, holding it up in the warm restaurant lighting. We did not toast to revenge or bitterness. We did not waste our breath mentioning the people who had tried to drag us down. I raised my glass, clinking it gently against his. We toasted to impenetrable boundaries, to the power of absolute financial literacy, and to the beautiful reality of the family you actively choose to build. I took a slow sip of the cold champagne, savoring the taste of total unbothered freedom. Have you ever had to cut off toxic family members to protect your own peace and financial security? Have you ever turned a painful betrayal into an opportunity to take back your power? Let me know your story in the comments below. Do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories about setting boundaries and letting karma do its job. The compelling narratives provided present a profound, unified lesson. Your fundamental worth is never defined by your family's inability to see it. In each story, the protagonist faced unimaginable betrayals from the people who were supposed to love and protect them. Whether it was having a hard-earned inheritance stolen by a brother being abandoned to face a brain tumor diagnosis alone, while family visited an amusement park being publicly disinherited at a dinner, or watching a child pass away, while parents prioritized a lavish $230,000 wedding. The underlying tragedy remains the same. These families weaponize their conditional love, expecting their daughters to quietly accept their designated roles as failures or afterthoughts. However, the ultimate takeaway is about the transformative power of redefining family and success on your own terms. The most crucial lesson learned is that walking away from toxic familial obligations is not an act of giving up. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation. True empowerment begins the exact moment you stop seeking validation from those who are committed to misunderstanding you. By setting uncompromising boundaries, these women stopped waiting for apologies that would never come. Instead, they channeled their grief into building self-made businesses, establishing supportive chosen families, and creating authentic lives where they were celebrated rather than merely tolerated. They proved that sometimes the healthiest response to being undervalued is to remove yourself from the equation entirely and build an empire of your own making. You do not have to accept cruelty or emotional neglect simply because it comes from blood relatives. If you find yourself constantly breaking yourself into pieces to keep toxic family members whole,